In the spring of 1961, in the hill country of central Kentucky, the land still carried its old rhythms, tobacco seasons, creek floods, and the kind of quiet that settled over a county seat on a Tuesday afternoon when there was nothing to buy and nowhere particular to be. Gordon Kincaid tended a 2.5-acre herb garden on a corner lot in Crest Hill that most of the town mistook for a weed patch. What looked from the road like wild tangles of overgrown weeds was, in fact, one of the most intentionally cultivated herb gardens in eastern Kentucky. Deep-rooted perennials arranged in concentric rows, many established for more than 2 decades, their root systems running deep into the clay-heavy soil. Gordon grew horseradish along the eastern border, its roots driving 3 and 4 feet down into the subsoil, thick and branching like pale fingers gripping the earth from underneath. He grew comfrey in dense clusters near the center, a plant whose taproot could reach 6 feet and whose lateral roots spread in every direction, building a network beneath the surface that no casual observer would ever suspect. He grew chicory, lovage, elecampane, and valerian, all deep-rooted, all perennial, all plants that came back harder after being cut back. What Gordon had built, without ever describing it that way, was a living infrastructure that the land had been quietly constructing for 3 decades. Every morning before the county stirred, Gordon walked his rows with a worn brass-handled trowel tucked into the back pocket of his overalls. It had been his father's tool, handed down without ceremony, the handle dark from decades of use, and the blade worn to a thin crescent on the right side from years of angling into heavy soil. He used it not to plant anymore. Most of what grew there had seeded and reseeded itself long ago, but to read the earth, to press the blade an inch or 2 down and feel the resistance, to understand what the roots were doing that season. In the early spring of 1961, the trowel told him the comfrey was pushing hard toward the northeast corner, and the horseradish crowns were swelling under a late frost. He wrote none of this down. It was knowledge he kept in his hands. The town of Crest Hill had about 2,400 residents and 1 grocery market of any size, Norman Yates's operation on Elm Street. Yates had expanded it twice in the previous decade, adding a freezer section in 1955 and a dry goods aisle in 1958. And both times the expansion had required negotiations with neighboring properties that Yates had handled efficiently, which in Crest Hill meant quickly and on his terms. By the winter of 1960, Yates had decided that what his market truly needed was a paved parking lot, large enough to accommodate 12 vehicles at once, which would require acquiring the corner lot next door, the one with the herb tangle that Gordon Kincaid tended like it was something worth tending. Yates made 1 low offer through his attorney in November. Gordon declined it. By January of 1961, Yates had stopped making offers entirely and started making phone calls to county council members instead. The town council believed in practicality. They saw untidy vegetation on a commercially zoned lot, and beside it a market that employed 11 people and collected sales tax. The calculation seemed obvious. Nobody on the council had ever bought herbs from Gordon. Nobody understood what he was growing or how long those plants had been there. Practicality is the belief that value exists only in things that can be priced. The town meeting was held on a Thursday evening in late February 1961 in the Harlan County Municipal Building. About 40 people came, including Dorothea Marsh from the post office and Alton Purvis, a burly tobacco farmer who had traded seeds with Gordon for years. Cecil Brandt, Gordon's closest friend, sat 2 seats to his left. Norman Yates arrived in a charcoal wool suit and sat in the front row without acknowledging anyone. He was 54, from a family that had been in Crest Hill for 4 generations, and carried the bearing of a man who had never been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. The compensation figure, $4,200 for 2.5 acres, was announced without apology. Gordon stood and said quietly that the roots of what he was growing went deeper than any surveyor would show, and that concrete poured over living perennial roots did not stay level for long. He said it plainly, without drama. Norman Yates turned and looked at Gordon with a thin patience that carried contempt beneath it. "Gordon, I appreciate that you're fond of your weeds, but this is a zoning matter, not a gardening lecture." Several council members smiled. Dorothea looked down at her hands. Alton Purvis did not look away from Yates's face. The vote was 4-1 in favor. Councilwoman Adkins cast the dissenting vote, saying only that the compensation was insufficient and the process had moved unusually fast. By the time the meeting ended, everyone understood. Gordon's herb garden would be cleared by summer, and the corner would be paved before the first frost of 1962. The eminent domain order was executed on June 14, 1961. Gordon was advised by a Louisville attorney that he could challenge the order in circuit court, but the process would take months and cost money he didn't have. He listened carefully, asked 3 specific questions, then said he would think about it. What he knew was that the law moved on paper and the land moved on its own schedule, and those schedules were not the same. What Gordon did in the weeks that followed was methodical. He obtained all 47 pages of the eminent domain filing and read every page at his kitchen table, marking them with a carpenter's pencil. The soil survey had been conducted by a Lexington firm specializing in road construction. It recorded topsoil depth, drainage characteristics, and load-bearing capacity. It did not assess root depth. It did not identify any plant species. The word perennial did not appear anywhere. Then Gordon harvested. He cut seed heads from the comfrey and horseradish, storing them in brown paper envelopes labeled in his careful handwriting. He dug up 6 horseradish crowns from the western edge and transplanted them to his property on Maple Road, working with the precision of a surgeon. He gave Cecil 12 comfrey divisions wrapped in damp burlap, explaining that comfrey was difficult to kill and easy to propagate. Cecil accepted them without fully understanding why and planted them along his fence line. In the weeks that followed, Norman Yates made his victory felt through social friction. He mentioned to the Farmers Exchange president that Gordon had made a fuss over a routine civic improvement. He remarked loudly to the county extension agent that some people had trouble recognizing opportunity. He arranged for the construction contract to go to a Lexington firm, bypassing local contractors, and made sure this was mentioned in the register as a sign of progress. Every action established the same message. The decision was final, and Gordon's resistance had already been absorbed and dismissed. The excavation crew arrived in early September with a case backhoe, 2 dump trucks, and a foreman named Davis. They expected 2 days of work. What they encountered recalibrated that schedule. The horseradish roots along the eastern border did not yield cleanly. They came up in chunks and broke off deep in the clay, white root flesh bright against dark soil, with more root going further down than the bucket could follow. The comfrey mass came up in a dense tangle that clogged the bucket twice. Gordon watched from the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, the brass-handled trowel visible above his right hip pocket. When Cecil brought coffee at noon and stood beside him, Gordon said, without taking his eyes off the backhoe, that they were getting the tops but not the bottoms. The backhoe pulled up another load of pale root material and dropped it with a sound like breaking lumber. "That's comfrey," Gordon said. "You can see the surface mass. What you can't see is the vertical root going another 4 feet into that clay." The concrete pour happened on a Friday morning in late September. The crew worked fast. They had another job scheduled for Monday in Frankfort. The gravel base went down in 2 hours. The concrete truck arrived at 10, and the crew worked steadily, screeding the surface flat. By 2 in the afternoon, 4,312 square feet of reinforced concrete covered what had been Gordon Kincaid's herb garden. The surface was leveled to within 1/8 of an inch across its full dimension. Norman Yates walked across the new surface the morning after striping was finished, his dress shoes clicking against the concrete. He stood at the center with his hands in his pockets, calculating the number of vehicles he could now accommodate, and found the number satisfying. He did not think about the soil beneath the gravel, beneath the concrete. Gordon Kincaid, that same morning, was in the narrow bed on Maple Road, where he had transplanted the 6 horseradish crowns in July. He knelt and worked the trowel into the bed, checking root development. Each crown had established well. He pressed the trowel into the soil one more time, feeling the root mass resist cleanly and firmly. He did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying yet. The winter of 1961 into 1962 was unremarkable. Moderate snowfall, 2 hard freezes in January, a thaw in March. The new parking lot served its purpose without incident. Nothing indicated that anything beneath the surface was continuing to happen. Gordon had less income that winter than any previous year since taking over the lot from his father in 1944. The herb garden had supplied 3 county restaurants with horseradish root, an herbalist in Harlan with dried comfrey leaf, and a pharmacist in Pineville with valerian root. Those sales were gone now, replaced by nothing. Gordon was 53 and not in a position to start over quickly. He took work helping Cecil repair fence lines and drainage pipes, accepting wages he would have been embarrassed to charge under other circumstances. The first visible sign came in spring 1963, a crack running along the eastern edge of the parking lot, roughly parallel to the old property line. The crack was a 1/4 inch wide and ran about 11 feet before tapering off. A maintenance worker filled it with concrete patch compound. 3 weeks later, the patch had lifted and the crack had extended 4 feet south. The worker filled it again. Gordon heard about the crack from Dorothea Marsh. She mentioned it in passing at the post office, watching his face to see if it meant something. He thanked her and didn't change his expression. What she noticed was that he didn't seem surprised. He asked one specific question: which edge did it start on? When she said the eastern edge, he nodded once, the way a man nods when a fact confirms something he already knew. Through summer and fall 1963, the crack network behaved with methodical consistency. New cracks opened parallel to the first, spaced roughly 18 to 24 inches apart, which corresponded, though no one in public works knew this, to the spacing of the horseradish crowns Gordon had planted along that border decades earlier. Each crack followed the same pattern, appearing as a hairline, widening to a 1/4 inch over 2 to 3 weeks, then lifting slightly as the root mass beneath expanded and pushed against the slab. The county patched the lot 4 times between May and November, spending $340 on materials and labor. The comfrey root mass was slower to manifest, but working steadily. Each broken root fragment became a new growth point. By fall 1963, the center section showed differential settlement, a barely perceptible waviness across 30 feet, visible only when a straight line was held against the surface, but real and measurable and increasing. In October 1963, Gordon retained the Louisville attorney and requested copies of the complete eminent domain filing. The attorney's review identified 2 irregularities. The first was a procedural error. The notice of petition had been published on the wrong dates, failing to comply with the county code requirement. The second was more substantive. The compensation figure had been derived from an appraisal firm that had performed 6 previous appraisals for the county, all at rates below independent market assessments. This created an appearance of a non-arm's-length process. Gordon listened to the attorney's summary and asked him to prepare the documentation, but not file it yet. He said he wanted to wait. The attorney thought this unusual, but had learned that Gordon had an unconventional relationship with timing. He prepared the filing, put it in a folder, and sent it to Gordon's address on Maple Road, where it sat in the drawer of Gordon's kitchen table, under the trowel, waiting. By spring 1964, the parking lot had become a recurring problem. The crack network had expanded across 2/3 of the surface, with 17 distinct fissures documented, the widest now 3/4 of an inch across with a vertical differential of nearly 1/2 an inch. The center showed a visible hump across an 8-foot span, noticeable to anyone walking across it. Water pooled in 3 distinct depressions after rain. Norman Yates called the original contractor and had an unpleasant conversation about warranty obligations. He called his attorney and had a similarly unpleasant conversation. The attorney said the warranty was narrow, and the contractor's position was defensible. Yates authorized a full resurfacing quote of $8,400, more than twice the original cost, and scheduled the work for June. Then, needing someone responsible for this, he filed a complaint with the county public works director. In late May 1964, while Yates was managing this complaint, he made a decision that would define the remainder of the story. A surveyor named Tolliver, hired by Yates for his expansion project, reviewed the county records for the adjacent corner lot, and noticed that the appraisal firm named in the 1961 compensation record had appraised 2 other parcels for county bodies, and all 3 appraisals had come in significantly below independent valuations. Tolliver mentioned this to Yates in passing. Yates said he understood. What Yates did next, within 24 hours without consulting his attorney, was contact the county recorder's office and request that the 3 appraisal records be pulled from public access for administrative review. It was the kind of move a man makes when he believes that information once contained stays contained. It did not stay contained. The records request flagged in the county clerk's office. A deputy clerk named Mavis Gentry noticed that the request had come from a private party rather than a county official. She mentioned it to Cecil Brandt, who was at the office that morning. Cecil called Gordon that afternoon. Gordon listened without interrupting and then said, "All right," in the tone of a man who has just been told that something he expected has arrived on schedule. He went to the kitchen table, opened the drawer, and took out the manila envelope. Gordon Kincaid's attorney filed the procedural challenge to the 1961 eminent domain order in Harlan Circuit Court on June 19, 1964. Not because the timing was optimal for the legal case, but because Yates's attempt to pull the records had created a window before those records could be sequestered. The filing cited the 2 procedural irregularities and also cited, as supporting context, that the same appraisal firm had been involved in 3 county acquisitions at below-market values, and that the records documenting this pattern had been the subject of a recent and irregular access restriction request. The filing was public record the next morning. Deputy Clerk Mavis Gentry made sure the courthouse reporter was aware of it. The story ran in Thursday's edition under the headline "Local Farmer Files Challenge to 1961 Property Seizure." The story included Gordon's quote, "I said at the time that the roots went deeper than any survey had shown. I meant it then. I still mean it." Norman Yates read the story on Thursday morning and experienced cold, computational anger. He called his attorney. His attorney told him the procedural irregularities were real and documentable, that the publication schedule error was a matter of public record, and that the appraisal firm's history was a thread a circuit court judge might find worth pulling. The records restriction request, the attorney said with deliberate calm, had been a significant error in judgment. The Kentucky State Auditor's Office opened an inquiry in early July, triggered by a separate complaint from another county that had used the same appraisal firm. The auditor's investigators were informed that the files had been placed under administrative review at Norman Yates's request. This information, entering the auditor's record, transformed what had been a procedural question into something requiring more thorough answer. By August, the Harlan Circuit Court issued a preliminary finding that the 1961 condemnation proceedings contained substantial procedural deficiencies sufficient to warrant a full evidentiary hearing. The court issued an interim order freezing any further development on the subject parcel. The resurfacing work had been completed at $8,400, but the order prevented Yates from putting the lot back into use. The lot sat empty through the summer, its freshly poured surface already showing new hairline cracks along the eastern edge, the horseradish roots, indifferent to resurfacing schedules and court proceedings, continuing their steady work from below. The evidentiary hearing was held in Harlan Circuit Court on a Monday in late October 1964. The courtroom was high-ceilinged, on the second floor of the county building on Court Street. the same building where the original town council meeting had been held. Dorothea Marsh was in the gallery. Alton Purvis was in the gallery. Cecil Brandt sat directly behind Gordon, his hands flat on his knees the same way he had held them 3.5 years earlier. The judge was Carlotta Reeves, who had been on the Harlan Circuit Bench for 11 years and had a reputation for reading every document in a case before letting any lawyer speak. She had read the eminent domain filing, the attorney's analysis, the appraisal firm's records across 3 acquisitions, the auditor's interim report, and the transcript of Yates's records restriction request. Judge Reeves found, after a 2-hour hearing, that the 1961 condemnation order was procedurally invalid on 2 independent grounds. The publication schedule had failed to comply with the notification requirements of the county code, a deficiency that could not be characterized as harmless, given that it went to the fundamental question of proper statutory notice. The compensation determination was tainted by a process that bore, in the judge's phrasing, the structural appearance of systematic bias. She ordered the condemnation set aside, the parcel returned to Gordon Kincaid's ownership, and a determination of just compensation to be calculated by an independent appraiser. The independent appraisal, completed in December 1964, valued the parcel at $11,800 and assessed Gordon's 3.5 years of lost agricultural income at $4,400 for a total of $16,200. The auditor's investigation into the appraisal firm's pattern expanded into a formal inquiry into whether county officials had knowingly used the firm to suppress acquisition costs. Yates's name appeared in that inquiry. His request to pull the records was in every document produced. In January 1965, Norman Yates withdrew from the County Planning Board election. The announcement cited personal business commitments. The Yates family market continued to operate, but the interior expansion was quietly shelved. He did not attend Lions Club meetings. Gordon Kincaid stood on the corner of Elm and 3rd on a cold January morning in 1965 and looked at the parking lot, still sealed with resurfaced concrete, still under the court's interim order, the fresh surface already showing new cracks. Dorothea Marsh stopped on her way to the post office. Alton Purvis crossed the street from the hardware store. Gordon had the brass-handled trowel in his hand, unusual for a January morning with frozen ground. Dorothea asked what he was thinking. He pressed the tip of the trowel against the widest crack, now nearly an inch across, and looked at the pale root material visible in the dark fissure below. "It's horseradish," he said. "Same plants. Still coming up." Alton said quietly that he owed Gordon an apology for not standing up at the town meeting 3 years back. Gordon shook his head and said that wasn't necessary. Dorothea thought she had never heard a more complete sentence than the one the ground beneath their feet was writing. The concrete was removed in spring 1965 in sections over 3 weeks. The removal revealed what 3.5 years of growth had built underground. The horseradish root system had generated new lateral networks extending beyond the original property line. The comfrey mass had regenerated from every broken fragment. The crew counted 41 distinct growth points across the area where the original crown had been. The combined root structure represented decades of continuous soil development that no reasonable construction project should have attempted to cover without full botanical assessment. Gordon replanted through summer and fall 1965, working alone most mornings with the brass-handled trowel. He did not try to restore it exactly as it had been. 3.5 years had changed the root map. He brought new horseradish crowns from the maple roadbed. The 6 he had transplanted in July 1961 had produced, over 4 years, more than 30 viable crowns. He re-established valerian and elecampane from seeds stored in his kitchen, and by October 1965 the lot looked like a managed wild area, which was exactly what it was, and always had been. Cecil Brandt spent a Saturday afternoon helping Gordon turn a northern bed. Over the course of that afternoon's work, he said he was sorry he hadn't understood sooner. He said he had thought, in summer 1964, when cracks were getting bad and money was uncertain, that Gordon had lost. Gordon worked the trowel and said he understood. Cecil asked when Gordon had known, not just hoped that it would work out. Gordon pressed the trowel into soil beside a root mass and thought about the question with care. He said he had known the roots would come through the concrete from the first week after the pour, because he had spent 30 years learning what those roots did when they met resistance. What he hadn't known was whether the human part would hold together long enough for the ground to make its argument. He had been less certain about the law than about the comfrey. The corner lot became, over the following decade, one of the more visited small plots in Harlan County, not as a tourist attraction, but as a place that people understood had a story attached to it, and the story was about patience and what survives when it is pressed down rather than destroyed. Dorothea began buying horseradish root from Gordon again in 1966 and told everyone it was better than before, which Gordon said was probably because the roots had gone deeper looking for moisture during the years the concrete was on top. Alton sent his farm hands to walk the lot each spring as a lesson in what perennial root systems actually did over time, calling it the best agricultural education in the county. Norman Yates sold the Yates Family Market in 1967 to a regional chain that remodeled it and dropped his name within the first year. He retired to the north edge of town and was not publicly heard from again in any civic capacity. The county revised its eminent domain procedures in 1966 to require independent botanical and soil assessments for any condemnation involving established vegetation, a change recommended by the state auditor and adopted without controversy. Gordon Kincaid worked his lot until 1979, when arthritis made the kneeling work too difficult. He scaled back to the Maple Road property in his final years and left the corner lot to Cecil Brandt's family with the instruction that whatever grew there should be allowed to grow. The brass-handled trowel he left to Dorothea Marsh, who hung it on the wall of the post office dry goods counter without explanation. Most people who looked at it assumed it was a decoration. The ones who knew what it was tended not to say anything, because the thing it represented was already visible through the window, growing as it always had, without being asked.